The halls of the old palace were heavy with silence. Stone walls rose high above the heads of servants, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of touch. Oil lamps lined the corridors, giving off a soft glow that mixed with the faint smell of wax and dust. Even the air seemed old, as if it had carried too many secrets for too many years. This was not a home. It was a monument to history, and within it lived the last of a family line that had ruled for centuries. Their portraits hung on the walls, kings and queens, princes and princesses, each with the same pale skin, the same narrow chin, the same long nose, generations of likenesses, repeating themselves like a pattern carved into marble. For anyone looking closely, the sameness was unsettling, but for the family who lived inside, it was expected. At the center of this story was young Prince Edward. He was 16, though his body often felt much older. His legs ached when he climbed the stairs, and his jaw was stiff whenever he chewed. Sometimes he stammered when he spoke, and his tutors would sigh and remind him gently to take his time. Edward had grown up surrounded by mirrors, not only the polished glass in gilded frames, but also the people around him. His mother, his uncle, his cousins, all carried the same face, slightly altered but unmistakably part of the same mold. It was a family tradition, he had been told, for royals to marry royals. Blood must not be diluted by commoners. Power must remain pure. What no one said aloud, at least not within the palace walls, was what happened when purity went too far. Edward did not have the words for it when he was a child. He only knew that his body felt fragile, that he tired quickly, that his hands trembled when he tried to hold a pen for too long. He knew that his uncle had difficulty walking, dragging one foot across the floor with each step. He knew that his cousin's jaw never closed quite right, leaving her mouth always slightly open, her speech slurred. He knew something was wrong, even if no one explained it. One autumn evening, Edward sat in the library, a heavy blanket across his legs. Outside, the trees bent against the wind, their leaves breaking loose and scattering across the courtyard. Inside, the fire crackled, throwing light onto the carved bookshelves. He tried to read, but his eyes blurred. The words refused to stay steady. With a frustrated sigh, he shut the book and stared into the flames. His tutor, Mr. Harris, entered quietly. Harris was not of royal blood. He was an American, brought in from across the ocean, and his plain manner often clashed with the polished rituals of the palace. Yet Edward liked him. Harris spoke simply, and he did not look at Edward with pity. "Another difficult evening?" Harris asked gently. Edward nodded. "The words move too much, and my head hurts." Harris studied him for a moment. "Your Highness, may I ask you something? Something that others perhaps do not ask?" Edward shifted uncomfortably. "If it is proper." Harris sat down opposite him, leaning forward, his hands folded. "Do you ever wonder why so many in your family suffer the same burdens? Why the same pain seems to return, generation after generation?" Edward's breath caught. No one had ever spoken of it so plainly. I notice it, but it is not spoken of. We are told it is just the way of things." Harris's eyes were kind, but firm. "It is not simply the way of things. It is a choice. The marriages within your family, uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, they are what cause this. When bloodlines are closed in on themselves, the weaknesses grow stronger. What you feel in your bones, what your cousin feels in her jaw, what your uncle feels in his legs, these are all the echoes of those choices." Edward looked down at his trembling hands. For the first time, the silence in the palace felt heavy, almost cruel. That night, Edward lay awake long after the lamps were dimmed. He stared at the ceiling, the painted angels looking down on him with frozen faces. His thoughts turned again and again to Harris's words. If weakness was the result of choices, then perhaps choices could change it. Perhaps the future did not have to mirror the past. The thought was terrifying. It was also freeing. In the days that followed, Edward began to see the palace differently. At meals, he noticed how his mother's hand shook as she lifted her spoon. He noticed how his cousin's laughter came out strained, her jaw unable to close around the sound. He noticed the portraits on the wall, each one a copy of the last, their faces stiff with duty, their eyes vacant. It was like walking through a hall of ghosts, and for the first time, Edward wondered if he wanted to continue their legacy. Winter came early that year, and the gardens were bare. Still, Edward liked to walk there, bundled in a thick cloak, the cold air sharp but clean. Harris often walked with him, their steps crunching over frost. One morning, as the sun broke faintly through the clouds, Edward stopped by the old fountain, its water frozen into glassy shapes. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly. Harris waited. "If I were to marry one day, if I chose someone not of royal blood, would that change things? Would the weakness fade?" Harris took a long breath. "It would not vanish at once, but yes. Over time, with each generation, the strength of new blood would mend what has been broken. The future could be different." Edward nodded, his chest tight with both fear and hope. "Then I must be the one to change it." It was not easy. The court was steeped in tradition, and every advisor reminded Edward of his duty. Marry a cousin, marry a niece, keep the bloodline pure. But Edward's heart was stubborn. He thought of the aching bones of his uncle, the twisted jaw of his cousin, the trembling hands he himself carried. He thought of the silence that had covered it all, the generations trapped by choices made long ago, and he thought of the future. A child running in the garden without pain, laughing, freely, unburdened by the past. The image gave him courage. Years passed, and Edward grew into a man. He still walked with a slight limp, still tired easily, but his spirit grew stronger. With Harris at his side, he began to speak gently, carefully, to his family. He suggested new ways, new ideas, small changes that seemed harmless but planted seeds of thought, and then, one spring, he made his choice. He married not a cousin, not a niece, but a woman from outside the royal circle. She was kind, warm, and unafraid of speaking truth. Her name was Anna, and when she entered the palace, the halls seemed brighter, as if the old stones themselves breathed a little easier. The court was scandalized. Advisors whispered, portraits seemed to frown, and traditions cracked like old plaster. But Edward held firm. He had chosen not just for himself, but for all who would come after. Years later, when Edward's first child was born, he sat by the crib and watched the tiny hands stretch in the air. The baby's skin was soft and warm, the breath steady and calm. For the first time, Edward felt something shift inside him. The fear that had haunted him since childhood, the fear of weakness, of sickness, of mirrors repeating mirrors, began to lift. He knew the child would not be free of all burdens. Change took time. But he also knew that the chain had been broken. The silence had been pierced. The portraits still hung on the walls, their pale faces watching. But now, in the crib, a new face stirred, one not bound entirely by the past. Edward leaned close and whispered, his voice trembling with both love and relief. "You will not live as I have lived. You will be stronger. You will be free." And in that quiet moment, in a palace heavy with history, hope bloomed like a fragile flower in winter, small but alive and growing.